My name is Kristian Stokke, and this video will introduce process tracing as an approach to case studies. Case studies are central to qualitative social science, but such studies are done in different ways and for different purposes. This makes it important to think through what the purpose of the study is, what it is a case of, and how it is studied. Process tracing is one approach to case studies that has gained some ground in recent years. It is especially prominent in political science and international relations, where it is often framed within a neo-positivist perspective on social science. However, it can also be used within a critical realist or interpretive perspective. Process tracing is a strategy to study causal mechanisms in a single case research design. It was initially formulated by Alexander George and was presented in a book on case studies and theory development in social sciences that he co-authored with Andrew Bennett. Their point of departure is the need for a strategy to examine whether correlations between independent variables and outcomes that are identified through statistical methods are causal or not. It is thus an approach that aims to open up the black box of causality between x's and y's. To take one example, it is found that there is a strong statistical correlation between democracy and peace, both in domestic and international politics. But how does democracy produce peaceful relations between conflicting parties? This question calls for attention to the causality, and the argument is that it should be done by tracing the mechanisms that produce the outcome. George and Bennett proceed to do this in a hypothetical deductive manner. To put it simply, their approach starts out by formulating a general theory about causality behind an outcome. It then proceeds to formulate and test more specific hypotheses about critical junctures in the process within this master narrative. This approach has to a large extent come to define what process tracing is, although George and Bennett also acknowledge that there are different ways of doing it. The last point is also at the core of a more recent book on process tracing methods by Derek Beach and Rasmus Brun Pedersen. They argue that there is much confusion about what this method is, that it should be sorted out by differentiating between three different approaches. First, theory testing process tracing uses the existing literature to construct hypotheses about mechanisms, which are then tested against the empirical facts of a chosen case. This is a theory-centered and hypothetical deductive approach that is also proposed by George and Bennett. But in addition, secondly, theory-building process tracing seeks to build a theoretical explanation from empirical evidence in a specific case, using the facts of the case to identify mechanisms and then construct a theory. Third, explaining outcome process tracing aims to find a convincing explanation for a puzzling outcome in a specific contextual case. This is a case-centric approach that is more in line with the ambitions of many qualitative scholars, in contrast to the theory-centric orientation of the previous two. All three forms of process tracing focus on causality. But what is the meaning of causal mechanism? Beach and Pedersen argue that the notion of causal mechanism is different from causality understood as congruence between variables. Neither should it be confused with the notion of intervening variables. Mechanisms are instead systems of interacting parts that work together or on each other to produce an outcome. Process tracing typically rely on Bayesian logic, where a part is found to be present or absent and to play a determining role or not. If we return to the example of democratic peace, it could, for example, be theorized the core mechanism behind democratic peace is the interaction between political actors that advocate liberal values and practices and governments that respond and are accountable to such groups and demands. If one of the parts is absent or weak, it can be expected that the outcome will also deviate from democratic peace. How do we study such mechanisms? Beach and Pedersen argue that the answer depends on which approach we employ. If the aim is theory testing, the process will typically consist of three steps. First, a theoretical conceptualization of the mechanisms. Second, operationalization of these. And third, collection of empirical case-specific facts that is analyzed and discussed against the background of the theoretical propositions and their operationalizations. If we are instead using process tracing for the purpose of theory development, the sequence will be reversed, going from construction of an empirical case narrative to identification of the mechanisms that are present in the specific case, and then to the formulation of more general mechanisms at the theoretical level. The last option, explaining outcome process tracing, can be pursued either along the deductive path of theory testing or the inductive path of theory building. It can also combine these in a sequential manner. The first step can, for example, be to examine the existing scholarship for potential mechanisms that can explain the case-specific outcome. In most cases, the literature cannot provide such sufficient explanations. This leads to a second stage where empirical data is used to identify case-specific mechanisms and reconceptualize the theories. Explaining outcome process tracing is thus an iterative research process where initial mechanisms are reconceptualized until a sufficient explanation is found. As should be clear by now, there are both differences and overlaps between these three approaches. What all of them have in common is a focus on causality in a single case studies. Process tracing is not a panacea for how to do case studies, but it provides some useful pointers for how to address causality in single cases. What kind of process tracing that should be chosen depends on the purpose of the study: to explain a puzzling case, to develop general theories, or to evaluate existing theories. Thank you for your attention.